So a very good morning to everyone, ladies and gentlemen, members of the media, esteemed panelists, and friends all around. Thank you very much for joining us for our very first event, first public event of the year, titled Post-COVID-19 Recovery, Building SME Resilience. So, sorry, I'm having a little bit of technical difficulties, but if everyone can confirm they can hear me, that's fine, right? Okay, great. All right, I'll carry on then. So I just want to say that IDEAS has been working very hard on research regarding this topic. And today we're not just having a webinar to discuss these very important issues, but we are also launching a policy paper, a report that IDEAS has been working very hard on over the last couple of months, talking to very many different stakeholders, including representatives from the SME industries itself. Our report actually focuses on 3 different industries, and this will be elaborated upon further by our Director of Research. We looked at manufacturing, retail, and tourism, the 3, as you know, most hard hit industries within Malaysia, as well as in other countries, as a result of the many movement control orders that the government has had to announce throughout 2020. And on that regard, I'd just like to thank the British High Commission for its support in providing us the resources that we were really in need of to interview, to conduct this very in-depth research. And on that note, I also would like to thank His Excellency Charleys Hay, the British High Commissioner to Malaysia, for joining us this morning. And we will hear some remarks from him later as well. I will also introduce the panel later, but for now, I'd just like to warmly welcome our 4 panelists. We have with us Mr. Yap Lip Seng, who is the CEO of the Malaysian Association of Hotels. Good morning. We have Engineer Ter Leong Leng, who is a council member of FMM, the Federation of Malaysian Manufacturers. We have Alida Adam, the Manager of Economics and Policy Division from the SME Corporation Malaysia. And we have, last but not least, in any way, Dr. Mohan Avvari, the Director of Research from the Nottingham University Business School. And I would like to also thank Dr. Mohan for all of his assistance. He's been very instrumental in putting this report together. He himself is no stranger to this kind of research, and he can talk about the other areas that he has been working on, looking at SME resilience in Malaysia. So I won't take very long, but I think I just want to emphasize the importance of this topic. Many think tanks, research organizations talk about impact of SMEs, but I think very few have had the opportunity of actually speaking to the industry players themselves. And this is very important. This sort of primary research is important because we do want to hear the voices from the ground. It's not enough to just talk about the various government policy and assistance packages, but also to assess whether these policies and programs have indeed been effective. And it's only when we know how to assess the effectiveness of existing policy that we know what remaining gaps are and how the government can realistically address these gaps in the coming months. So looking back, I think this is a very good time to look back. I mean, we are, of course, at the very beginning of the year, still in January 2021, but this is a good time for us to pause and to look back at all the months of 2020. Now I know all of us have been through a lot, you know, the kinds of challenges and stresses that we individually went through, of course, having to work from home and pivot our business models and so on, but none as greatly as the SMEs felt. The SMEs, as we know, are really the backbone of Malaysia's economy. And the Prime Minister has said that our first MCO, starting from March 2020, cost the economy as much as 2.4 billion ringgit a day. A lot of that, as I believe, is shared, this sentiment is shared throughout the panel, was born by the SMEs. And I believe that if the situation does not ease, if there is not more clarity over the way that we are going to manage the situation moving forward, we will probably see even greater impact in 2021 compared to 2020. So I think while in 2020, 9 months out of the 12 months, the SMEs, if they did not already face struggles and challenges, or even having to shut down, and you will see some statistics of this later presented by Laurence. I think many of those that perhaps had the liquidity to hold on, or perhaps did receive some government assistance, will be taking a very hard look at themselves at what options are still available, what options remain to be available for this year. We don't have a health expert on the panel, but that's another thing to consider as well, because of course, the recovery of our economy is needing to coincide very much closely with the availability and the rollout of the vaccination program. The Minister of Science and Technology and Innovation, of course, has said that the vaccinations will start to be rolled out as soon as February or March. But even then, I think there are going to be prioritizations. So the large population of the country will not get vaccinations this year. So I think the closest time that people like us can consider vaccinations will be next year, which means that for the rest of 2021, this remains to be the biggest stumbling block for our economy to recover. And we know that the economy is a complex animal. It's not able to bounce back as quickly just when you lift lockdown measures. The economy is not able to bounce back so quickly just because of the intricate relationships and of course the value chains that connect every part of the economy together. So on that note, I think I will stop there because we have much more esteemed and reputable panelists ahead of me. I'd just like to express once again that Ideas is very honored to have been able to do this sort of research and representing the voices from the community, from the industry, and we're glad to have some of your voices here today as well. And I hope that many of you there in the audience are also able to share your comments and your feedback to the report and to perhaps improve what kinds of recommendations that we can bring forward to the government as we continue this very important research of how SMEs are impacted by COVID in 2020 and beyond. So with that, I'd like to thank you once again for joining us. And I'd like to now introduce and pass the time to His Excellency Charleys Hay, who is no stranger to Malaysia, and he will speak for about 10 minutes. And I would also like to inform everyone ahead of time that he will have to regretfully leave us slightly early at 11. So His Excellency Charleys Hay, British High Commissioner to Malaysia, over to you.
Tricia, thank you very much. Thanks for the opportunity to speak, and thanks for the opportunity also to support you in this really important work as part of our efforts to support the Malaysian economy as we are trying to grow back better from this COVID crisis. It's interesting because I think in the past, governments have tended to rather neglect the SME sector. We tend to focus on sort of big business. I think that is changing. But the report does pull out, I think, very well the critical role of SME in Malaysia, with something like 50% of employment being accounted for by them. And the same pattern, you can see the same pattern pretty much everywhere. And the paper sets out very well how that sector really has borne the brunt of the economic hit from the MCO and from COVID. Now, it's interesting because as a diplomat, I'm not often asked to talk about the SME sector because it's not a sector which British business tends to get directly involved in, for obvious reasons. We need to understand the SME sector as part of our overall economic work and understanding the economy, but I don't often get to talk about it publicly. So it's a great opportunity for me to do that. It's very interesting. I'm a member of a number of WhatsApp groups, and in one of the WhatsApp groups, a fellow head of mission said to the group that he was going to see the finance minister. What should he talk about? And what was really interesting was that a lot of Malaysians commented on that group, you must talk to the finance minister about SMEs and about the SME sector. And that was from people who were not themselves in the SME sector, but they could see very clearly how critical the sector is and how much it needed help and support. So that was very striking for me, and it shows how timely this report is and how important the policy recommendations that you put forward are. And of course, there's the wider context. COVID is a crisis to the whole economy and all of our livelihoods. And we're all talking now about growing back better. But what does that actually mean? I think it means an opportunity to restructure our economies, to innovate and to become more sustainable. And I can see a lot of very interesting pointers in this report as to how that could be done in the SME sector here in Malaysia. I'm not going to cover all of the excellent analysis and recommendations that you make. I just wanted to pull out some things that I found very striking about the report. First thing is regulation and other barriers to setting up and running businesses. Now, this is something that is regularly raised with us by British business. And of course, regulation plays a really important part of any economy. You know, we need health and safety, we need fair competition, we need product quality, and so on and so on and so on. But the report, I think, does note that in some respects, Malaysia's got a bit to do in some areas in order to make itself an even better place to do business. And I think that would benefit not just the SME sector, but the economy more widely. And as we get further into the digital age, I think we really need to be asking ourselves all the time whether these barriers, these regulations actually achieve their original purpose, or if we should now refocus and kind of re-engineer them. It was interesting, the point that was made that in retail, to open a small shop needs maybe up to 10 different licenses. And yet we know that, for example, when you look at the alcohol, tobacco, and some other trading areas where there's a huge amount of fake product around, which seems to be able to slip through the net. So on the one hand, the sector seems to be very highly regulated, but on the other hand, we can see that that regulation doesn't actually work in terms of keeping some of these unsafe and dangerous goods off the shelves. And that's not just a threat to our health, but it's also a huge loss to the government in terms of excise and customs duties. And that income is much needed at the moment during the COVID crisis. So maybe it's time that we all need to look at the shift to a more streamlined system of regulation and more enforcement of those regulations rather than the establishment of large numbers of them. And it was interesting to read about the restrictions on the structure of retail in terms of shop sizes and so on and so forth. And you know, you can understand why the policy was set for these shop sizes to protect and preserve local businesses, and that's fully understandable. But it's very interesting to see that the outcome that you get from that and the pattern of retail then becomes very hard to shift into the digital age. And the report, I think, brings that out very well. And that is another reason to look again at all these regulations in the light of what we now understand about the future of retail and the future of the economy. On digitization and the move from bricks and mortar, we're all seeing a convulsive change as we move to online shopping. And that has been very much accelerated, of course, by COVID. And in the UK today, for those that follow the UK news, Debenhams, which is a huge and old chain, is about to close. And it's interesting that they have been bought, but the buyers are not interested in the bricks and mortar shops. They're interested in the brands, and they're interested in the digital database, the marketing database of the company. And that's the way that we're all going. And it was really encouraging to read, actually, from your SME case studies, how they were embracing digitization, how they were embracing new channels and new marketing methods, like using influencers. And, you know, innovation takes many forms, doesn't it, depending on the business and the sector. And the role of government is not to direct that, if you like, but to enable by making it possible for companies and SMEs to innovate. I was also really interested in the points made in the report about the need for upskilling and the need to look again at TVET. The education relationship between the UK and Malaysia is very, very strong, and most people would think about the university sector and about the school sector, but actually TVET is an area that we're also very interested in working closely with Malaysia on. And we had some events planned which we had to cancel because of COVID, but I think this is an area where we all need to do more to work together. And I'd be interested in any ideas and proposals from you on how we can do that. I was also very encouraged to see the points about sustainability in tourism, but also in manufacturing and in retail. And this is definitely the right way that we need to go in terms of that whole building back better agenda. We need to find ways to respect biodiversity, to reduce plastic waste, reduce carbon emissions. And I agree with the point made about the huge potential for Malaysia in sustainable ecotourism. And for me, there is a clear link between these two areas of upskilling and sustainability, and that's the move away from using large numbers of migrant workers in the economy, which again, a point made in the report. And I think that trend has to be the right way to go as Malaysia works its way up the value chain. The report also references poor labour practices, and I think there's a growing awareness of this in the wider world, particularly the phenomenon of so-called modern slavery. And consumers in the UK, the US and elsewhere are increasingly demanding that workers in the supply chains of goods that they use are treated well. And we see that most obviously in sectors like PPE production, electronics, plantation industries. But I think this is a growing trend, and it will become an absolute business and a necessity, as well as the right thing to do from a human rights perspective. I just wanted to say a couple of words which was sort of tangentially covered, but it wasn't the real focus, about the role of SMEs in generating growth and exports. And I think this is an area we all need to pay more attention to. And in the UK, we've been doing quite a lot of work on this, and we now understand better the role of SMEs in international trade, in driving that prosperity and economic growth. And we also find that businesses that export, regardless of the size, are typically stronger and more resilient than other similar businesses who do not export. So last year, the UK government launched the so-called Export Growth Plan, again, part of the Building Back Better, to encourage SMEs and other companies to export more, to build their export capability. Exporting can be a pretty daunting prospect for SMEs, and the implications for an SME, if you get it wrong, can be very severe. So we focused a lot of our support on building capability, providing advice and guidance, identifying the right market and how to get in front of customers. And in Malaysia, it's the excellent and active British Malaysia Chamber of Commerce who are busy introducing British SMEs to potential business partners and undertaking market research. Another very important point brought out by the report is the issue of accessing finance. And the financial challenges for SMEs, whether or not they export, is often a particular concern. In terms of how the UK is doing what we can to help support the Malaysian SME sector, I also wanted to say that we're working closely with the Malaysian government and the World Bank to share lessons and best practice in economic and regulatory policy development. We've got a budget of nearly $2 million to do this work. And specifically, we're looking at areas of investment, competition, and SME development policy. We started this work before the COVID crisis, but it's all become increasingly more relevant given the hit on SMEs by the crisis. So let me finish there. I think there's lots and lots of really important food for thought in this report. I really hope it's going to be a great contribution to the debate, and the practical policy ideas will, I hope, feed through into the Malaysian government as they think about the next Malaysia plan and how to build back better. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency, for your remarks. And thank you for taking the time to so thoroughly read the reports, mentioning not just the main points, but also the ones that have been made on the side. So I think you've mentioned many of the important things, especially on labor, which I think will be an increasing, as you mentioned, international trend that the Malaysian companies will need to look at. All right, so now I'd like to welcome and introduce Laurence Todd, Ideas Research Director, who will be presenting the findings from the report, which will now be made available on our website soon. So for those of you who would like to download that, but Laurence, go ahead.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Tricia, and welcome to everybody this morning. So as Tricia has mentioned, I'll be presenting our research on behalf of our economics team. This was a multi-party effort by our team here at Ideas, and as Tricia has already mentioned, we're very grateful for the advice and support of Dr. Mohan for advising the general research direction and reviewing the report, and of course to the British High Commission for providing the resources for us to undertake this important research. So I'm just going to run through the main observations and conclusions from the report, although the High Commissioner has already touched on many of the main points. So hopefully I can elaborate on some of those. So I'm just going to share my screen here. So I think by one point of introduction, I think is important to make is in the framing of the report. So what we really wanted to dig into was some of the longer term issues around the resilience of SMEs to the types of challenge that COVID highlights, some of which have already been mentioned by the High Commissioner, including the need to be digital, the need to automate, and so on. But of course, it's not possible to talk about SMEs in Malaysia right now without also examining how the MCOs themselves right today are causing extreme challenges and how the government's response is being implemented. So I sort of see that we try to cover both those aspects in this report. We both look at how are the current measures to support SMEs through the crisis, how are those being implemented, what are the gaps in implementation? And then secondly, what about the longer term development of resilience of the SME sector? How far is government support going to try to build back better and prevent SMEs from suffering in the event of similar shocks? So we were, of course, hoping that by January 2021 would be more focused on the long-term recovery. Of course, with the reimposition of the MCO, we're still in a situation of trying to manage the immediate crisis. So I'll try to draw out conclusions from both parts of that. So I'll start with some overall comments on COVID-19 in Malaysia, just to provide some context. So of course, as everyone's familiar, we've been battling with the pandemic since last year. We had and crucially, the battle stepped up in March last year when we introduced the first nationwide movement control order. That's been followed by a series of iterations of different levels of restriction on the economy and has been matched by a series of economic stimulus packages, or ESPs as we refer to them. So this began in February with the first set of policies announced actually by the previous Pakistan Harapan government, and then has been preceded by subsequent large packages of support. And then, of course, most recently, we've reintroduced the MCO in specific states, and that has been accompanied with a new fiscal support in the form of the PERMAI package. So the scope of our report focuses on the up to the Kita Prihatin package, but very happy to talk about the PERMAI package as well in the Q&A. And I think our initial observation is that since this extends many of the measures introduced in the previous round of packages, that the general observations and policy recommendations continue to apply. So I think we can all recognize that in Malaysia, as globally, the rounds of movement control orders have had a significant impact on the economy. We anticipate an overall contraction of about 5% in GDP in 2020. We've seen multiple rounds of unemployment and business closures throughout the year, particularly in the early phase of the MCO. And I think, as has already been highlighted by both Tricia and the High Commissioner, we also see that SMEs are bearing the brunt of this economic hit. Various surveys taken throughout the MCO have highlighted the challenge that SMEs have had to face, with large numbers of SMEs reporting a collapse in revenue, especially during the early phases of the MCO, many SMEs closing and having certainly to look at options such as retrenchment and downsizing. So as I mentioned in the opening, I think in addition to the severe economic impact, the crisis has also provided this forcing moment for us to look at digitalization and automation, as well as other measures to strengthen the resilience of our economy. And these have both been long-standing policy goals, particularly for SMEs. If we look at different government policy documents, the emphasis on trying to promote digitalization among SMEs has been a strong theme in the last couple of years. So beyond the short-term crisis, there is the pressure to function differently will also remain in the new normal, and the pressure to ensure resilience to future shocks. When we look at the economic stimulus packages, however, we do see that by our analysis, there is a significant weight in favor of short-term response, i.e. measures that are intended to support to support businesses to survive the immediate cash flow crisis that the movement restrictions and the drop in revenue created. In comparison, we judged that only about 13% of the ESPs up to the ProMI package were targeting sort of long-term, build back better, developing resilience. Now, and this is not to say that we needed to spend less to help SMEs survive the crisis, of course not, but it is to highlight, I think, the relative focus of the packages so far and the need, therefore, to think very carefully in 2021 about how we do more on the long-term resilience building mission. So the short-term measures largely constitute the wage subsidy, tax deduction, the loan moratorium, utility discounts, and soft loans. And therefore, but in comparison, there seemed to be insufficient support for a more sustainable recovery and reset for the Malaysian economy. At the same time, we also do observe implementation gaps, even among these short-term measures. So even in trying to distribute support in the short term to help SMEs survive, there have been a number of gaps that we need to address. So what does this report seek to do? So firstly, we want to address the longer term question of how we're going to help SMEs to build resilience for future shocks. And at the same time, we also want to look at the implementation of those measures to help SMEs survive. So as I said at the beginning, we do try to address both those questions because they're both extremely relevant. Naturally, the situation in 2020 was unprecedented. I think a lot of researchers were reflecting that probably the next 10 years of research is going to be heavily influenced by looking back at what happened in 2020. So I think we hope that this report can provide a modest contribution to that debate. And so in light of that, our research aim was to try to fill that gap through on-the-ground information from SME operators themselves and other relevant stakeholders to better understand the shortcomings in the policy measures, both in that short-term survival and in the longer-term recovery and reset, and provide evidence-based insights for policymakers. So the way that we did this was to try to develop, and I know there have been multiple different ways of conceptualizing the support provided to the economy during this time, but the way we tried to think about it was looking at the respond, so those short-term measures to help SMEs through the immediate crisis of the movement restriction order, and then looking at the longer-term recovery and eventual reset potentially moving into, say, changing or repositioning SMEs across different sectors to build resilience, whereas recovery is how to bring those SMEs back into the marketplace, having gone through the crisis. So we tried to segment the policy measures implemented by the government into these different categories and assess their effectiveness and implementation. And we focused on the sectors of manufacturing, retail, and tourism, which we perceived as being both critical for the Malaysian economy and also being some of the hardest hit by the movement restriction orders. In terms of research methods, we undertook both desk research, including drawing on surveys undertaken by different associations and other groups, as well as engaging in our own primary research, a number of interviews across government agencies, academicians, business organizations, and SMEs. And I've listed some of the stakeholders that we engaged with there on the right. And we're very, very grateful for everybody that took the time to speak with us during this research. We also undertook some more in-depth case studies with specific firms that we felt had an interesting and important story to tell, and demonstrated some of the broader trends that we were identifying across the data and in our other interviews. So these case studies, we're extremely grateful for the businesses named here for being so open about their experience and to share that for the purposes of research. And you can read more about these individual stories in the report. Okay, so I'm going to move to talk now about what we found and what we think the implications are. So starting with manufacturing. So manufacturing was in the early stage of the MCO, I think it's important to recognize this, one of the most severely hit because the closure of non-essential services and the reduction of manpower, particularly at ports, and the impact that had on the supply chain. So we saw a significant drop in production, in exports, and in manufacturing employment. A survey undertaken by FMM and MIAR, I think, highlights some of the challenges, particularly in that early phase of the MCO, drastic decline in business activities in the first half of the year, nearly half of businesses in manufacturing reporting to need to reduce headcount, nearly over 2/3 expecting a reduction in business over the next 2 years, and significant local sales declines. So a serious challenge for the sector. in order to, in terms of responding to that short-term crisis, we see across the ESPs different measures that were effective in terms of reducing the immediate kind of cash flow challenges. The wage subsidy, the loan moratoriums, tax relief, and utility discounts, in order to highlight the principal measures. I think there's some important gaps in the implementation of this response package, though. And I think although some of this is quite tied to that early period of the MCO, I think it's really important to document these lessons. So the lack of timely updates specifically on port operation guidelines caused significant delays and knock-on impacts in terms of supply chains, which had a knock-on impact for the rest of the year for the manufacturing sector. And I think that's important to consider, that in terms of responding to future crises, how we get into that crisis setting more effectively and do that in discussion with businesses so that we can manage that transition is crucial. And this is a crucial lesson because we're, of course, still tackling this challenge in the current MCO. Secondly is the access to financing. So there's a general concern that private banks that were tasked with dispersing of the special relief funding prioritize existing customers, and therefore the choice of disbursement mechanism introduced some bias into how that important relief measure was implemented. Also, we found that loopholes in the guidelines, or rather just restrictions in the guidelines to determine the size of threshold of businesses. So whether an SME counts as an SME is very particular in terms of the volume of turnover, number of employees, and so on, actually created some cliff edge thresholds, by which there were some businesses that probably should have been able to access those funds, but weren't able to because they had technically, in their accounts last year, just tipped over that definition into a medium-sized business, for example. So I think that was a problem in terms of businesses that really needed support and had become SMEs because of the crisis, not being able to access it. But as well as the immediate crisis of the MCO, there's also important global trends that are accelerated by the pandemic. So this is something that we want to highlight sort of in all the sectors, is not just surviving the crisis, but also using that crisis as that forces moment to adapt to these broader trends. So firstly is the supply chain reconfiguration of MNCs. So there is significant movement in supply chains globally, responding to different factors in the global economy. And this does present, we think, significant opportunities for high technology production in Malaysia. So there is an upside opportunity in the last couple of years in terms of the manufacturing sector. As well as been mentioned, there is a significant acceleration towards more sustainable financing, as alongside and driven by also public scrutiny on sustainability. So again, I think that shift to more sustainable forms of production also presents a significant opportunity for manufacturing. And these things align with some of the challenges introduced by the pandemic in terms of being more sustainable through automation, for example. So we also see that the response to the pandemic needs to take account of these broader trends. However, we also see that previous policy tools and nudges to try to push the manufacturing industry in that direction have suffered in some ways. And this raises questions about the long-term ability for Malaysia's manufacturers, especially SMEs, to adapt to these trends. So what do we mean by that? So in terms of looking at the long-term picture of manufacturing, manufacturing share of value added in gross national output has stagnated. And we haven't seen rather the structural shift from lower value added labor intensive industries towards higher value added knowledge intensive industries. So that's been really highlighted by the pandemic because the lower value added sectors that have relied more on labor intensive production, for example, have struggled to operate more. And that is accelerating a trend of demand for more value add that's happening in being driven by broader changes in the global economy. So SMEs are overrepresented in these lower value added parts of the manufacturing sector and primarily compete on cost as a result. So in this graph on the right here, we just demonstrate the distribution of where SMEs are across different manufacturing subsectors. And you can see that the majority are in the lower tech subsectors and relatively few are in the more high tech, mid and high tech subsectors, which are typically represented by larger firms. So in 2019, only 6% of innovation was driven by SMEs. So COVID-19 was potentially seen as a catalyst to change some of that, with the Malaysian government intensifying its effort to encourage Malaysian SMEs in manufacturing to transition to Industrial Revolution 4.0. And this was represented through the establishment of several grants and loan facilities to boost IR 4.0 and green tech adoption among SMEs. At the same time, there was also an attempt to restrict foreign labor hires and incentives to hire locally in order to kind of move away from this labor dependency, particularly foreign labor. So these initiatives were modeled on previous public policy interventions that we judge were unsuccessful due to gaps in expectation that I'll try to explain. So the first is that SMEs face some challenges in their access to government grants, and this limits their ability to scale up the value chains. Because the SMEs mainly populate the low value added labor intensive subsectors, they may not have the technical knowledge or capacity to make the immediate jump towards IR 4.0. Then I think what's very important is that previous public grants approved to try to help SMEs upgrade have tended to focus on projects that are in higher tech sectors. So if you look at the graph on the left, looking at the projects approved by automation grants, you can see a high concentration among machinery and electronics, which are those sectors that are already quite high tech and where the SMEs are less concentrated. So it's sort of the flip image of the previous graph that shows you the distribution of SMEs. So we think in the future, the government needs to take a broader perspective towards what automation, digitalization, upgrading means. It doesn't have to just mean extremely high tech projects in existing high value companies. It can be more basic things, more back end and more utility innovations. The second challenge is in terms of the skills needed to facilitate this kind of upgrading. So the big challenge, as already been alluded to by the High Commissioner, is that we see that TVET graduates are not currently in a position where they're industry ready to help SMEs make the jump towards IR 4.0. Multiple businesses and industry stakeholders told us that they do have to invest quite significantly in the training of fresh grads. So students coming out of TVET courses do still need some significant investment before they have the necessary kind of real world industry knowledge to be effective in helping SMEs adapt and be more digital. Now, if you look on the left-hand side, we can see the challenge here, which is that significantly, as we move through smaller and smaller firms, they are significantly less likely to be able to have their own in-house training budget. So when there's a burden on the business to provide for the training of people to become able to facilitate that upgrading, then SMEs are increasingly not able to meet those costs. So how we reform to make sure that TVET produces kind of industry-ready hires is going to be essential if SMEs are able to bring in the talent that can help them pivot and move up the value chain in this way. So we think that these kind of two examples of kind of critical expectation gaps. So the R&D public grants and loans are issued to upgrade SMEs, which is great, but the approvals are skewed towards highly advanced projects, and therefore SMEs lower down, more in need of support to move up, are not able to access them. The second problem is that the second expectation is that the government is incentivizing hiring of local workers, reducing this dependence on foreign labor, as well as to help nudge that moving away from labor intensive production. But the current education system is not producing graduates that are industry ready, and the smaller companies do not have the budget or capacity to invest in training. So I think we see this sort of underlying structural challenge in helping to build this resilience and upgrading of our manufacturing SMEs. So to move on to quickly discuss retail. Retail was one of the worst hit service subsectors, naturally, a very physical industry, a large employment footprint across the economy, lots of SMEs. So you see various surveys here from throughout 2020. I think unlike manufacturing, where manufacturing, I think, was able to stabilize and has now a kind of clearer set of SOPs with the government around how to operate. Retail, of course, is one of those areas that sort of is the first to fall when we re-enter an MCO, to the extent that the Malaysian Retail Association has anticipated that the peak of the impact for retail will actually hit in January this year, when we expect to see over 50,000 stores closing. Again, for retail, this is happening at a time of other trends. So it's no surprise that, of course, the big story here is digitalization. So digital ubiquity is becoming the new normal for retailers, with or without the pandemic, and the pandemic has, significantly accelerated that. On the other hand, convenience has also become very, very important for consumers. And that is leading to its own forms of innovation. So 40% of Malaysian consumers, for example, now use e-wallets for online purchases. So there are these underlying trends that the pandemic is sort of is accelerating or putting further pressure on. However, for Malaysia's retailers, there does seem to be a lag in adapting to some of these trends. And we do see a continuing preference for retailers to operate a business in a physical premise rather than a virtual one. So if we look at the response to the initial response to that shock, again, we see that the immediate cash support provided by the ESPs was very important, but there were some significant gaps in terms of implementation. So the first one, and I think this is a really important theme to highlight, is the high rate of informal businesses and workers in the retail sector. So I think about 20% of informal businesses are in retail. So it's the highest, it's the sector with the highest proportion of informal businesses. And those informal retailers have much more limited access to support mechanisms, given that they're not classified and they're unregistered. So this was a major challenge, I think, in terms of being able to reach the retail sector with the support that was on offer. Secondly, and I'll talk a bit more about this, but a one-size-fits-all effort to digitalize businesses was actually much more challenging for the smaller retailers than we might have anticipated. That immediate shift to moving online was actually much more challenging, especially for the smaller firms. Although there were cash subsidies to consumers to boost consumption, there was a tendency, these were provided without any conditionality, so that meant that they probably, in a digital marketplace, that additional spending accrued to the already successful firms that perform well on those platforms, rather than being more targeted at a local level to those firms struggling more. So when we look at the longer term measures, COVID-19 was seen by many as an opportunity to accelerate digitalization. The e-commerce industry itself played an important role here. Grab ran campaigns to encourage Malaysians to support local businesses. The Grab Loves Local Heroes campaign. The e-Penjana had Shop Malaysia online. But there is significant skepticism over this digitalization agenda because of some underlying challenges. So the first one I think to highlight is the high transition costs. I think because for consumers, these e-commerce platforms are so convenient, we assume that there's little cost involved. But actually the additional cost might be, 20–30% commission. And that can force a sort of reinvention of the business model and that can be quite difficult to do for a smaller firm. So in future, we could look at policies that really try to understand what it means for a business to transition to online retail. So for example, Singapore did introduce commission fee waivers to help people move on to food delivery platforms, which had a positive impact in terms of increasing local businesses' sales from food delivery. So I think sometimes we perceive that the shift to online is really simple. Look, the platform is there, it's great, you can reach a lot of customers. But actually, because of the way it shifts the cost structure of the business, it can actually be more difficult than people anticipate. The second is another point about skills. I think when retailers move online, and this is work that Dr. Mohan has done a lot on and can perhaps comment on more in his remarks, the premium on different skills changes. The way that these online platforms work, for example, is that brand recognition is extremely important. If you imagine that as a small retailer, you move from competing on the street with maybe 4 or 5 other businesses next door for passing traffic. When you move onto an online platform, suddenly you're competing with thousands of different businesses. So brand recognition, marketing becomes very, very important. I mean, and is actually directly shaped by how the e-commerce platforms structure search listings and so on. So having people in the team that understand how to operate effectively online doesn't just become a nice optional extra, it becomes an essential sort of business business necessity. Now, as I touched on in manufacturing, the ability for SMEs to recruit or to find that industry-ready talent is stretched. But particularly as we moved into the MCO, where businesses were already in a lot of difficulty, I think there wasn't some significant attention paid to the fact that SMEs will not find it that easy to immediately move online because they don't have some of these talents. So I think that's something that we need to address moving forward, is also that when we talk about tech talent, it's not just, of course, the programming and hard skills are really, really crucial, but it's also about developing skills, sort of broader business skills about what it means to operate successfully online, what a good digital marketing strategy is, what digital innovations are in the retail space. And then making that skilled labor available for SMEs in a sort of industry-ready way. So finally, the other, I think, major point to highlight for retail is, and has already been alluded to by the High Commissioner, is the regulatory frameworks. So this links back to the point I made in terms of the implementation gap around informal businesses. So in terms of being able to access support, both in the short term and the medium and long term, for SMEs, the barrier of formalization is critical. And what we see is that in retail, there are quite significant, the regulatory framework is quite burdensome in terms of the complexity of licensing and different permits in order to operate. And this acts as a barrier for companies to formalize. And moving forward, not just in terms of being able to distribute support in the event of a crisis, where formalization is really important, but beyond that, if the government is going to be able to provide the SME sector a helping hand, ensuring that those SMEs are able to be sort of formalized is really crucial. So we do think that as part of the recovery strategy, making it much more easy for businesses to formalize must be an essential goal. And I think related to this, and I'll touch on this briefly when we talk about tourism, the regulatory framework is also important for existing businesses. We see, and you can see some examples in some of the case studies in the report, a few businesses actually pivoted. So, okay, I can't do retail, but maybe I can shift and do actually a bit of production, right? I can make some products. Now, if we're going to facilitate that, we have to have a regulatory framework that allows people both to become businesses quite easily and also shift their business model quite easily and enter different sectors. So the regulatory framework is both a barrier, I think, in terms of responding to these kinds of crises in the short term, and a barrier to the sort of longer term adaptability and resilience of the Malaysian economy. Okay, so finally, I'm going to talk about tourism, and I'm very pleased we have our colleague from the Malaysian Hotel Association, who I think can elaborate with much more kind of detail and color from his perspective on what's going on for the hotel industry. But I will just make some highlights from our work here. So of course, tourism has been one of the extremely hard hit sectors with the complete closure of international borders and travel restrictions. So we've seen significant drop in visitors, significant drop in arrivals, and obviously as a result, significant decline in tourism expenditure. Again, the tourism industry is also one that came into the pandemic with some other important long-term trends that provide hopefully a path to recovery, but also represent challenges. So the two that we highlight are shifts in tourist behaviors. So increased demand for digital products, cashless, contactless payment, cloud-based property management. Tourists in Malaysia specifically continually cite like wanting to be able to plan their own itineraries and not work through travel agents and so on. And then related to that is the acceleration of digitalization. So particularly the rise of super apps within the tourism industry, such as the new ASEAN Super App by AirAsia. And of course, the way that the hotel industry is shifting to be part of that sort of sharing economy through entities like Airbnb. So the challenge then, when we think about the longer term resilience of our tourism sector coming out of the pandemic, is to what extent is the tourism industry in our country able to adapt to these shifts? So looking at the implementation of the ESP, again, starting with the short term, again, we see the same kind of crucial measures important to providing that cash flow support. I think some points to highlight on implementation gaps for the short-term response are information asymmetry. So the lack of awareness or access to information for particularly hotels was a particular challenge in terms of being able to respond swiftly to the crisis. I think it's really important to highlight the point of timeliness. Again, I think some of this is going back to the early stage of the MCO, so although we're sort of past it in one sense, if we're going to learn the lesson, we need to really look at what happened. And I think speaking to some hotels, and maybe we can hear more about this in the panel discussion, timeliness was really crucial, because actually by the time the wage subsidy was available, for example, several hotels had already had to close. So I think this question of the timeliness and the access to the support at the right moment is very, very crucial. Linked to that was the complicated application requirements. So we did speak to several firms who found it just too difficult to access the support at the right time, and preferred to kind of stick with their existing financial support. And then also, like, not all targeted firms had equal access to funding initiatives. Hotels that were temporarily closed were not eligible for financial assistance, for example. So again, we see some sort of artificial cliff edges in who can access support, and which we don't feel was in the spirit of what the support was trying to achieve, but because of the way the policy was crafted, created these gaps for certain parts of the industry. In terms of the longer term picture, of course, the government measures were helpful in addressing those the serious long-term impact. There's been, allocation 200 million of matching grants for HRDF to train 40,000 new workers, upgrading of infrastructure and tourism facilities up to 2 billion. We have a new national tourism plan, which is a really important step in terms of the longer term recovery of the tourism sector. However, as in the other sectors, you can see the pattern here. The question is, do these reforms, do these longer term facing measures really account for the structural challenges of tourism SMEs? So I think what we encountered speaking with the tourism industry is three important things. So firstly is this sort of a sort of fear of competition, and a perception that there's an uneven playing field, which discourages our traditional SMEs to invest in digitalization. I think that we can recognize that companies like Airbnb, represent sort of really impressive innovations that are really important for the direction of the tourism industry, but they also represent a significant disruption. And I think that has damaged the confidence and trust that the tourism industry has in moving in the direction of digitalization. Travel agencies, which we spent some time with in particular, are also worried about the returns on making such an investment. They see risk of returns just in the model of operating online. They point to failed digitalization in the past. And then crucially, I think there's kind of lack of confidence in being able to compete with the larger online travel agents. So I think for the existing SMEs, there's this kind of more existential concern that arises when faced with the competition of the new digital platforms. Linked to that is a perception not just of the disruption of these newer platforms, but actually that there's a sort of bias in the way that the current regulations and taxation is introduced, and that relatively Airbnb is significantly less regulated with respect to the traditional hoteliers who are subject to quite significant licensing and permit requirements. So the sort of fair enforcement of these across, or how we build a regulatory framework that accounts for innovation, but also fairly treats different types of players is very crucial in order to see the sort of long-term sustainability of our tourism industry. And crucially, if we're going to provide a path for our current SMEs into that new shape for the industry. And finally, the same theme of terms of even within the existing tourism model, quite striking, we see a quite outdated regulatory framework. So the Tourism Industry Act, I think in particular, I would highlight as an act that is in need of updating. We see several quite onerous clauses around how restrictions on the type of vehicles that can be used, the need to license individual tour guides. And we see that there's probably a break where the way the tourism industry is regulated, it's probably too controlling and doesn't take that approach of building a competitive and safe marketplace that protects consumers, but allows for innovation. At the moment, the Tourism Industry Act is too restrictive in how it dictates the traditional tourism industry has to operate. And at the same time, there is much more limited regulation on the new platforms coming in, that is what creates this perception of an uneven playing field. So I think we need to address the regulation of the new platforms, as well as innovate and modernize the regulation of the existing industry. So I think that's why, again, we highlight the issue of these regulatory frameworks that create a barrier to adaptation and competition and innovation in the industry. So I know I'm running over time, and we want to get to the panel discussion. So I'll just wrap up very quickly. I think the three themes that we would highlight is implementation gaps in the government crisis response should be addressed to better prepare for future crises. So whether that's in information asymmetry or the lack of timeliness, delays in disbursement, loopholes in the way the guidelines are structured, or the financial institutions that we use to disperse the funds, how we can ensure that is all done more fairly. The report tries to highlight those gaps and suggest ways forward, which is going to be very crucial if we continue to see future packages rolled out in 2021. Second is that the longer term recovery, which focuses a lot on automation and digitalization, really needs to understand where the industry is today and what are the gaps. So the 2 points I highlighted in respect to manufacturing is, how do we make sure grants are helping SMEs who really are in need of more support to upgrade? And then on the skills side, how do we create kind of industry ready graduates through the TVET system when our SMEs don't have the capacity or finances to invest in training? On the retail side, it's recognizing that shifting to online is a real business model transformation that needs a more broader package of support. And again, a skills gap where we need not just skills in the hard digital skills, but also soft digital skills in terms of digital marketing and operating in an online retail space. And finally, I think I mentioned, particularly in the tourism and retail case, how we build a regulatory environment that creates more room for our businesses to do two crucial things. One is to formalize, so that we actually bring more of our business sort of out of the dark and into the regulated space, so that we can distribute aid more effectively and then in times of crisis, and also ensure that there's access to these support mechanisms in terms of longer term development. And secondly, it's important to address the regulatory framework to provide for more innovation and adaptation by businesses within and across industries. So I think particularly in retail and particularly in tourism, I think I would highlight the challenges of the existing regulatory frameworks that I think are now out of date and in need of an update to create the conditions for that more innovative, adaptive business environment. So I'm really looking forward to the discussion. I think we have some very interesting panelists with different perspectives. I'm just sharing here some questions just to sort of, that I will certainly be interested to hear from the other speakers. What is the outlook for SMEs? Now we're at the beginning of 2021, we're back into MCO, but we've also learned a lot of lessons in the past year. What are the gaps and shortfalls in government support to SMEs to survive the crisis? Do people agree with some of the issues that I've highlighted? I hope this is reflective of the SME experience, but we're constantly learning and constantly looking to hear more about what the challenges really are. How well are our Malaysia's SMEs, particularly in these three sectors, placed to adapt to the new normal and develop greater resilience to future shocks? It's one thing if we all just survive it, but actually, are we genuinely building back better? And what are the barriers to building back better that if we don't remove, we're just going to be in the same position when the next crisis hits, whether that's climate or another pandemic? And then so finally, then how can government policy support SMEs to achieve that level of resilience in the future? And how can we learn the lessons from the last 12 months of economic stimulus packages and also the history before that of industry support? Because that's going to be absolutely crucial if we're going to get our SMEs to a point where we're able to be more resilient in the face of future challenges. Thank you very much. I'm sorry that I'm sure I went over my time, but there were a lot of points I wanted to cover. Please do go and download the report on our website. And thank you once again to everybody that contributed and to all the businesses that shared their experiences with us. We really hope that this is a helpful contribution. I mean, we're of course humble about the scope of the report, but we do hope it is a helpful contribution to the urgent challenge of how we build back better and promote promote that essential resilience among our SMEs. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Laurence, for your excellent presentation of the findings in the report. And maybe I just have a quick question because I also don't know the answer to this. I know that we interviewed a lot of different stakeholders, and I think we have like representation from 32 different stakeholders, but do we have a number of how many people we actually interviewed? Because I know we spent a lot of time interviewing people, whether it was face-to-face or online, and this actually matters because I don't think many other institutions have had the benefit of going to the ground and speaking to the actual industry players.
Yeah, so I think in total, probably about sort of 40 interviews, but not all with businesses, so with different stakeholders. And then what we did was we did very in-depth case studies with 6 businesses that represented sort of particular stories that we think told, picked up on some of these wider trends. And then so we tried to use that to then triangulate against what we were seeing in the data and the published surveys and so on. So yeah. Okay,
thank you very much, Laurence. Yeah, so I think these are very important voices, and the fact that we actually recognized that there were implementation gaps. So the government tried to roll out all these stimulus packages, but obviously the reach was not necessarily able to meet the expectations at the end of it. And I do hope that if there are any people from government here, we can also learn from these lessons for the coming stimulus packages. So without further ado, we actually have 4 very distinguished guests as panelists, and we don't want to get in their way. Each of them actually has been allocated 10 minutes. So we can go through the 10 minutes, but if your presentations, if you would like to shorten that, you're also free to do that so that we can actually have more time for interaction and Q&A, because we will be ending at noon at 12 p.m. So let's first introduce Dr. Mohan Avvari. Dr. Mohan is, as mentioned earlier, the Director of Research at the Nottingham University Business School. And he was also part and parcel of the team looking at the report. So Dr. Mohan, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Tricia. I'm being heard clearly, I presume? Thank you. Good morning, everybody, to the 85 participants that I can't see and in the new norm. First of all, I was told that I should never start a presentation this way, but I'm going to do it anyway. Thank you, Tricia. Thank you, Laurence. Thank you to all present in the panel, because one of you was also a subject of our interview, Mr. Leong Leng, and also to the other people, wonderful RAs who helped put this report together. It is very important, and it is a good Asian tradition that we should follow. I also learned something from Namibia, all protocol observed, because we also have His Excellency here. Instead of reading out everybody's name, that's how the Namibians do, which they learned from Germans apparently. Bit of cross-cultural blah. But anyway, I'm going to also do some unconventional statements. The times I was clicking off my camera, I was looking at the level of digitalization of SMEs. Parallelly, in another room, my wife is WhatsApping our vegetable vendor to deliver goods home. We are not buying from Tesco's, although it's British, I'm sorry, Your Excellency, or from Jaya Grocer. We are supporting local vendors. We are pushing her to get to local growers as much as possible. And that's her branding right now, a Pasamalam vendor. And she now guarantees my wife, we don't have the data for it, that it's locally grown produce. The reason I'm telling this is because there's a question in the question panel. How should you do digitalization? And I believe one of our interviewees from Hexa Spices had this to say: simple technologies micro SMEs can use. Through WhatsApp and a bank transfer, we've never stepped out of our house in the last 1 year to buy vegetables. We are vegetarians, and that's an important commodity in our life. And 3,000, I'm from India, by the way, so the Indian households in Brickfields and KL Central are part of her database. Your Excellency, you made a statement that Debenhams is now valuable because of its customer database. So this lady now has a pool of Indian women, excuse the gender, but it turned out to be a woman salesperson and women buying it. Very interesting ways you can digitalize if you have ingenuity. That's the Nottingham word for our innovation center, by the way. And the challenge now for SME Corp or the Hotel Association or FMM is to see who are these entrepreneurs with ingenuity and how do you remove barriers, regulatory barriers for such people, right? Brilliant vendor. And while my wife is doing that in the living room, I switch off the camera and I'm communicating with India to get my marriage certificate stamped with the Ministry of Education, Ministry of External Affairs. I'm sorry. I've taken up a minute of my time, I realize. I'm having to renew my visa with online documentation, but my marriage certificate requires me to run around in an MCO between the Indian High Commission, who tell me that I have to get it stamped in Delhi with the Ministry of External Affairs. And there's an online system that's brilliant, but my certificate has to go physically there. She just put a post in the WhatsApp group of the Indian community, and it turns out there are 1 million agents. I'm using this term because I'm also coming to the innovation mandate. The importance of intermediaries. Everybody keeps saying you have to remove them, not necessarily so. So as we look at a few factors of resilience of the SMEs, and particularly micro SMEs, the issue of interrelated factors of branding and trust in supply chains, etc., how interesting it is. I came back from the High Commission crestfallen because it'll only be 1 million members queue in Delhi if I have to go to the Ministry of External Affairs with 1 billion population. But in 2 working days, and with a little bit of help from DHL and an agent, I'm going to get it back in a week. How interesting digitalization and low-tech digitalization. I'm very glad you picked up that term, Your Excellency, from the report. We were also doing certain other surveys where one of the SMEs in Malaysia, in the auto component sector, proudly used to use the term autonomation. And he was very fascinated that he uses gravity for moving his products from one lathe to another with zero labor, zero electricity, just by designing his whole shop floor to be a gradient. SME Corp has this case, by the way, Alida. You will see it in your InnoCert program, one of the earlier recipients. So there are brilliant innovations, brilliant ways in which digitalization can take place. And Tricia, I'm so glad you may use the term voices, which we also use in sustainability. How important the voices are for future researchers, for policy bodies, for business associations. Right? With that opening, some of the interesting factors that emerged in the previous webinars that IDEAS organized, and also in the interviews, right? So most of the successful, resilient SMEs were always looking at markets beyond. From a small person, one of our alumni who does the swimwear, not a fascinating product for me in any way in the research world, but it's not even a need or a basic need kind of thing in an MCO condition. But she survived because the first thing she thought was to look beyond Malaysia and use the super apps for that. Again, how does she differentiate herself? And Your Excellency, you pointed it out again, the use of influencers, a small young girl in Malaysia. And if you link it to the other case study, Krisen, similar such things, they were all always thinking beyond Malaysia to start off their success stories. And the MCOs, the CMCOs all kept them going nevertheless. I'm not going to use concepts, but this is the only place where I want to use concepts because 7 years of studying SMEs in a project that we had with ERIA, the Economic Research Institute for ASEAN and beyond, the SMEs that seem to understand their competencies and pivot and diversify were the ones that seem to be surviving competition and definitely diversification. I believe Mr. Yap might be knowing this. The Lotus Group is a very interesting case, right? Hotels that close down. What do you do with the infrastructure? Your capabilities are servicing certain people. And they're very quickly pivoted to a market that is growing now, the old age homes. There's nothing wrong in saying that. There are quite a lot of aging population in Malaysia. So how interestingly and with ingenuity, you see points of survival and response and resetting of businesses, which have policy implications. And many a time the regulators need not do anything to support as long as you don't block. Private sector, I'm sure, can come out with very interesting solutions. As we go on, Your Excellency pointed it out. Laurence, your presentation was fantastic. The issue of brand building with clear purpose. And we have to be very clear, brand building is different from positioning. How your company looks vis-a-vis competition versus the brand that you stand for. And it's interesting to see companies like Krisen, Pink and Proper, and more beautifully, My Burger Lab. It's after all a burger. It's not even a Malaysian iconic dish. But that case is fascinating. And we're very happy because he's our alumni, Your Excellency. We are supporters of that unashamedly. He doesn't pay me a single ringgit for advertising. But if you read the case, on every element in the report, the amazing things these young boys did, whether it's stakeholder engagement, and this is where there are two business associations here, the critical importance or the importance of business associations in innovation, in information asymmetry reduction between the government and the voices is very, very important. I believe that in Singapore, the associations are supported by the government, whereas here it is surviving with the membership kind of thing. So I'm very happy to use this forum even to promote that, how useful it becomes as an information processing tool. But for me, it's also important in terms of innovation in my studies, right? And this goes on, inventory management back to basics. It was all about JIT and you should never have stocks. That's completely out. All these companies never studied Western literature and they were happily stocking up and it served them very well. The Western literature also talked about interesting inventory management models through storage. So what should companies think about? Could there be policy implications for these? There are, because inventory is always related to financial policies, especially interest rates, how the governments and the banks play with interests when you have to stock up kind of things. So these are some of the other policies. I wanted to bring up the issue of local supply chains. I have nothing against globalization. We were just having a family discussion about tourism and how should it be moving forward. That was the bucket list for the family as the girls were growing up. I suppose nothing is wrong in global travel. It is part of our agenda that has got stopped. But how could we look at local issues? My one and only trip to Africa in 2019, and all we did was to look for local products. And there were very few locally available Namibian products, even in the market for Namibian products. It was either made in China or made in other parts of Africa. How should this sort of artisan industries grow? In Nottingham City, we were fascinated to see the area called Lace Market is closed to chain stores, even British chain stores. It has to be only local artisans, whether it's restaurants or products that have to be sold. So very interesting ways in which the government, city councils can work in promoting local supply chains without going against the realm of globalization. Globalization can be there for products that don't hit hygiene, like semiconductors or electronics and manufactured products. They move without viruses. But these kind of local supply chains for food, for artisans and so on could be very fascinating. And I'm sure Japan and European countries can offer interesting ways in which you can develop this. And in the UK's case, the creative economy and how we can blend it into a local supply chain issue, right? So how we can look at it for sectors. And now let me build it down into the last 2 minutes of my interest. I actually wanted to call the report an innovation manifesto, because digitalization, supply chains, anything can be there. And when I say innovation, I don't just mean new ideas. For us, the definition of innovation is when the new idea reaches market or when the new idea reaches the society. And it doesn't have to be changing every year. I'll give one example. I'm not paid to advertise Toyota, but most of us know this car. I believe, Your Excellency, you know it too, the Toyota Innova. It took 10 years for them to change the design, and all the component manufacturers who supply to them have the most beautiful jobs. They don't have to do anything much. Nothing changes. This is one of the most beautiful innovations based on market needs. So when we looked at innovations, there was the small Taman Besar sub-region based bakery and how he thought about sandwiches that should be made without refrigeration and they should remain fresh. How do you support such innovation? Versus the My Burger Lab guy who designs DIY kits and rides around delivering it himself during the MCO. One of my colleagues in UK is a specialist in cold supply chains. We were very against it. And the lady in my life, my wife, is anything against cold storage. She believes the vegetables should move very quickly. But there seems to be a way in which you can marry the two also. And My Burger Lab's innovations showed that sort of a thing. So Laurence, you pointed out the importance of logistics for this, not just ports, but local logistics, policies around these, how governments can support information policies and so on, right? So these sort of things, and of course, Mr. Leong Leng's company, which does R&D in manufacturing and in terms of machinery related issues or auto components, or for example, one of our respondents, Hexa Spices, never using the term R&D, but having a lab. We also interviewed a chocolate company, incidentally, and she doesn't even know the term R&D. She just calls it our food lab and our nutritionist. So various ways in which government should recognize research and development. 20 years ago, incidentally, I'm from India, and my career in innovation started this way, in a study with our professors. And they knew it and they recorded it, that R&D incentives were not reaching SMEs by virtue of definitions. The SMEs were not using the term R&D centers. They had research going on within the manufacturing realm and so on, right? So these are...
Sorry, but you need to wrap up.
Right, that's the last point I wanted to say, which have great implications for policy. Thank you very much, Tricia.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Mohan, for sharing your experiences in Namibia all the way to India and then of course back to Malaysia. So I have some questions, but I think I'll leave that to later. So I'm going to now invite Engineer Ter Leong Leng, a council member from FMM, to share his point of view. So evidently manufacturing was one of the first sectors that our report covers. So we'd love to hear from you, Mr. Ter, what you thought of the report, the recommendations, and also, does it reflect what you and your members in FMM experienced over the course of the MCO? So over to you now.
Okay, thank you very much, Tricia. Very good morning to His Excellency, fellow panelists, and all participants of this morning's event. First of all, I'd like to start off by telling everyone that I'm doing this session in the comfort of my house for two reasons. One is because of the work from home policy. The second reason is because of the broadband speed. Before we talk about digitalization and so on and so forth, we are still having issues of broadband speed, broadband stability in industrial areas. I can't do a proper full meeting in my office in the industrial area because the signals get cut off here and there. So it's something that we really need to look at. Our national fiberization and connectivity plan, we really need to speed up on that before we can talk about SME resilience, digitalization, and so on and so forth. Okay, anyway, to start off this comments on this note, I'd like to thank Ideas for the opportunity given to FMM to share and reinforce our views. It's very good research. I think a lot of points are highlighted in this research are points which FMM has been highlighting to the government through various channels. But having a independent research think tank like Ideas to highlight these points, hopefully can strengthen the understanding of the policy makers and hopefully revisit some of FMM's and industry's proposals. Now, we also see in this report that stress on the importance of business associations. I think Dr. Mohan mentioned just now. People like us, we are sitting in the board serving as volunteers in the association because we see the importance of having a voice for manufacturers to bridge between the industry and the government. Okay, I'm also a SME myself, SME manufacturer, running a company manufacturing machineries. So we are SME. So today I'm going to share with you some of the perspectives of SME manufacturers. First of all, please allow me to highlight very briefly on the importance of SME manufacturers. Of course, there's various statistics that you see everywhere on the importance of SME, but how important are SME manufacturers specifically? Together, we contribute. Of course, we have 47,698 of us, 47,000 SME manufacturers in Malaysia. Together, we contribute 7.7% to the national GDP. Share of employment is 7.9% and export 8.6%. So we are an important component of the economy, SME manufacturers, even though the number is not very big, 47,000. Of course, out of 900,000 SMEs throughout Malaysia, there are about 5.3% are manufacturers. But nevertheless, we are a very important component of the national economy. Next, I'll go to the recovery of SME manufacturers, post-COVID recovery. Of course, everybody knows, from the middle of last year, the economy was recovering. When movement restrictions were easing, economy was recovering. Of course, all sectors were recovering, including the manufacturing, because supply chain is all interlinked. So we're recovering, and from manufacturing data from second quarter, the sales was 282 billion. Second quarter last year. Third quarter it was 358. For exports, manufacturing, second quarter was 182 billion. Third quarter was 227 billion. So from all this, you can see that from second quarter moving to third quarter, it was recovering. Of course, unfortunately, moving towards year end, the third wave hit, and the government were forced to introduced a second MCO recently, but we have learned a lot from the first MCO, I believe. You know, it taught us that, you know, total shutdown is not a solution. Yeah, of course, you know, it helps a lot in terms of, you know, flattening the curve. Of course, we're not saying it's not important, but there has to be a balance between health and economy, between livelihood and life. Yeah, so we have learned from this that it's very important for us for the industry, for the SMEs to learn to live with this pandemic. How we're going to overcome it, how to live with it. It's not going to go away. Yeah, so of course, it is also worth noting that first MCO, as what Tricia has mentioned just now, has cost us about 2.4 billion a day. But this second MCO, because of the very simple reason that it's not a total shutdown, industries are still able to operate. The losses per day has been reduced to about 700 million. This is according to the prediction. Okay, next, I will go to the challenges faced by SME manufacturers. As for everyone's information, FMM, we do research economic survey every 6 months to get the latest feedbacks from the ground. Yeah, of course, we have got various feedbacks. I think this is not new. Number one challenge faced by SME manufacturers is cash flow, of course. It's the number one killer. Number one reason why companies goes down is not because no sales, no profit, but it's because cash flow issue. Second challenge is the loss of revenue. From our survey, we saw that about 80% of SMEs during the first half of last year experienced at least 30% drop in revenue. Of course, compared to last year to this year, last year a lot of manufacturers were still having WIP, you know, from previous order, from previous contract, they were still doing WIP from year 2019 and before MCO. But then, you know, as this pandemic continues, you know, there were less and less new orders. So this is going to affect the revenue as well. So, of course, we do appreciate the government's effort in rolling out various ESP. FMM members have found some of the programs very, very effective, very, very useful. Number one, of course, everybody knows moratorium. Yeah, the moratorium. Unfortunately, this moratorium does not help all SMEs because like some SMEs, you know, they take financing from leasing companies. The leasing companies are not obliged to provide moratorium to the SMEs. So some of our manufacturers also facing this issue that, you know, they were taking financing from leasing companies that they're not enjoying the moratorium. Wage subsidy program is another program that is very popular and we find very useful. Special relief fund, I think it was also mentioned by Laurence just now, the issues with special relief fund that is not reaching to to a lot of SMEs. You know, it was channeled through the commercial banks. However, commercial banks were prioritizing on the key customers, which they deem as low risk. You know, the rest of the SMEs, you know, new SMEs or smaller SMEs, they deem them as high risk. So because of that, a lot of these SMEs were not able to get the financing, but the banks were dispersing the funds mostly to the key customers, to low risk customers. So this is another issue. Subsequently, of course, Penjana SME financing PSF was introduced, but however, the quantum was too small. You know, it was not able to reach out to a lot of SMEs, and we're also having issues of the speed of the disbursement. It was not being disbursed at the speed as fast as we expected. The red tapes and all these procedures were still there. You know, the banks were still treating it as pre-COVID, the kind of situation. Okay, I think I'm running out of time. Of course, other issues also mentioned that information asymmetry, that the information was not disseminated in effective manner to the industry. The scope of assistance, I think it was also mentioned. I don't want to go into detail, but the government agency have to understand the situation on the ground with the manufacturers. A lot of manufacturers are still in Malaysia, are still in, for example, industry 2.0, still in 2.0 stage. So to move from 2.0, it's a gradual process, gradual transformation. So the keyword here is gradual transformation. So you cannot expect when you go to SMEs, you know, you expect to see a lot of this high-tech machineries, high-tech technologies being utilized, but it's a different level. So the agencies have to understand this very well. Right. So these are some of the issues that we were facing with regards to digitalization and automation. And of course, another areas I want to highlight is SMEs are market-driven. wherever there is a demand, there will be supply. So this is market force. Being entrepreneur, whenever there is a demand in whatever areas, there will be entrepreneurs finding ways to how to meet the specification and requirement of the supply chain. And SMEs have to comply also with laws and regulation. A lot of times manufacturers are looked at as exploitative. I think this perception have to change also. When issues of, for example, accommodation of workers arise, a lot of manufacturers will look at this stereotype of labeling us as exploitative. I think this has to change. A lot of manufacturers, of course, there are minority of them, but majority of the manufacturers, they have systems in place, of course, to comply with the Act 446, Section 17A, and so on and so forth. And also in certain industries, like electronic industries, if you were to supply to them, you have to comply with RBA, EISS. So all these things are already keep us in check to make sure we comply. All right, I think in the interest of time, I will summarize, conclude by saying that the IDEAS report, particularly the section on manufacturing, has covered many of the issues faced by the industries and made sound recommendation acceptable for the industry. We like, especially on the R&D box article. I think the R&D box article, I read it myself. It's really reflective of exactly what's happening in the SME manufacturing sector. When you go to SME manufacturers, you cannot expect to see patents. You cannot expect to see a lot of PhD holders in the SME manufacturers. You don't see that, but you do see innovations everywhere, embedded everywhere in the company. I think this was very clearly highlighted. The two industry case studies also clearly epitomize the entrepreneurship, innovativeness, and resilience of SME. And also, Hexafood has acknowledged the value of industry association as one very important body. So, finally, I'd like to thank once again to IDEAS for providing us this platform and opportunity to express our views. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much to Engineer Ter Leong Leng, and of course, all of your colleagues at FMM. I think we regularly call on you and your representatives to speak and to provide us insights from the ground. I'd like to now turn to another industry player, just so that we can do the industry representation first. So sorry, Alida, not that you are not important, but I'm trying to get the industry reps to speak first. So I'm going to invite now Mr. Yap Lip Seng, who is the CEO of the Malaysian Association of Hotels, MAH. And I understand that he has a slide presentation. So Mr. Yap, yes, you can go ahead.
Thank you, Tricia. Before I move on to the slides presentation, just let me touch a little bit on a couple of points that was brought up earlier. ABNB, I think this was brought up as an innovative company and platform that actually changed and disrupted the industry. What we want to reiterate here is that ABNB did not disrupt the digitalization of the hotel industry. Hotel industry has always been digitalized, and we are one of the industry that are first online to allow bookings and everything else. But what ABNB, we must realize platforms like this is that what they disrupted is actually the legal framework of the country. It allows people to do business where they're not supposed to do business. I always use the example, if now I create a platform similar to Airbnb and I allow people to sell alcohol from their home or even serve alcohol, turn their homes into pubs and bars, do you think the country will allow it? That's definitely, and it's clear-cut illegal, right? But why is it Airbnb is allowed to do so? So what it disrupted is actually the legal framework. And on regulations, I think we touch a lot on regulations in your report, Laurence. I think we talk about regulations. Yes, the industry is over-regulated in many ways, but the other problem on it is actually the enforcement. Enforcement is consistently imposed on those who are licensed, but not those who are out of the framework. If you're not licensed, if you're an illegal operator, you will likely not get any visits from the enforcement officers. But if you're licensed, you're in the system, they will come and visit and they will enforce on you. So that's another problem with the regulations. The current MCO, we touch on that as well. Yes, actually is different from the MCO we had last year. We allow a lot of businesses to operate, but it doesn't work for tourism. You can allow tourism operators, hotels to open, but nobody's traveling. It's not going to give us any revenue. So that is a problem with the current MCO as well. And one more thing I just need to touch on is the Laksana report. If you notice that the finance minister is publishing the Laksana report on a weekly basis, the Laksana report is a source of information for the government, and it only reports all the positive numbers. It only reports what initiatives has actually achieved, but it doesn't address gaps. It doesn't address the current problems on the ground. So we need to address that issue with the government, that they must listen to people on the ground and not just the Laksana report. Let me just go into my slides now. I'll just quickly run through the slides here and just a little bit update on what the current situation is. Okay, all right. Let's look at the outlook and also a little bit of historical trends. Let's forget about the historical part there. We look at 2018-19, we just compare Kuala Lumpur with other countries and put a little bit of focus on year 2020. If you look at Singapore, Singapore is achieving an occupancy rate of 73%. And that is driven by the government incentive that allows people to be quarantined at hotels, and they're paid quite well for that as well. In comparison, look at Kuala Lumpur is only at 26%, and the outlook for 2021 this year is a thunderstorm again. It's one of the worst in the region, and we are not expecting any recovery from that. This is what we have studied on what happened to the hotel industry last year. Based on comparison with 2019, the occupancy has, of course, it has dropped a lot. Look at the month of April, for example, it was 8%. And from 18 March onwards, it was actually about 5% only. And we have calculated a total loss of about 6.5 billion ringgit of revenues in the industry. And then, of course, the hotel industry is a very labor-intensive industry. We depend a lot on people because it's all about service. So from our survey, we have actually conducted and updated this survey last year in October. More than 60% has reduced the manpower, and more than 17, almost 18% reduced by more than half, which means they've cut off more than half of their manpower. And other than that, they're imposing pay cuts, unpaid leaves, and laid off the employees, and also reduce employee benefits. And if you look at the operation, the P&L of the hotel operations, the cost of manpower has gone up by at least 16 percentage points. Means every dollar that a hotel earns now, half of it goes to pay manpower and wages, which is, you look at it that way, actually not even a profitable business to get into at all. Then we look at wage subsidy. We spoke a lot about wage subsidy, but we keep insisting and repeating this to the government that is insufficient for the tourism industry. It may be sufficient for the manufacturing, it may be sufficient for other industry, but tourism industry is the one industry that's first hit hardest, and it will be the last to recover. We need more than that. We have proposed a percentage-based wage subsidy. In comparison, look at Singapore. Singapore is paying 75% of wages, and it maxed out at 4,600 Singapore dollar per employee per month. And UK at 80%, Canada at 75%, and even Australia is giving $3,000 per month per employee. And we are only 600 ringgit, and that's limited with a lot of terms and conditions. And moving forward, we will not expect any international arrivals in the next 1 or 2 years. So it will be highly dependent on domestic market. Based on our survey, the domestic market is about 55% of the hotel industry's business. And if you compare the per capita expenditure of domestic tourism, it's only 432 ringgit. And international tourists actually spends about 3,003 when they visit Malaysia. So how is the industry going to survive only banking on domestic market? And looking at the numbers for domestic market, for 432 is of course also because they stay in non-commercial accommodation. They stay in their families' homes or their relatives' places or their friends' places, or even Airbnb for that matter. So the domestic market will be the one single market that the industry needs to look at moving forward. And to facilitate that moving forward, the reopening and recovery of tourism industry, we need to give them assurance of safety and health. And that's where the Malaysian Association of Hotels came out with the Clean and Safe Malaysia certification with the Bureau Veritas Certifications International. And it is we came out with the guidelines, and it's recognized by the Ministry of Tourism, and hotels can apply and go through the entire certification process, just like an ISO certification or a HACCP certification for F&B. And with this certification, we can give an assurance to guests coming into Malaysia and staying in the hotels that this hotel is safe. You can stay here in the hotel, and you can be assured that you will be safe and everything will be clean accordingly to the SOPs and to the guidelines of the Ministry of Health. And at the moment, we have 123 hotels on program with 70 already certified. So that's all I want to share on this at the moment. And I believe we can speak more about the industry later on. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Yap. I think, I also have opinions about this, and we chatted a bit earlier before we started about this, but we can talk later. Maybe I'll just invite our final panelists. So again, last but not least, please, Alida Adam, over to you. So Alida is from the SME Corporation.
Yeah, thank you, Miss Tricia. Can everyone hear me? Okay, Assalamualaikum and good morning to the panelists and His Excellency and everyone here in this session. First of all, I would like to say thank you to the organizer for inviting SME Corp Malaysia to share some thoughts on the report entitled Post-COVID-19 Recovery, Building SME Resilience. Okay, as you're all aware, in Malaysia, SMEs constitute about 98.5% of the total business establishment. Majority of the business are in the services sector, mainly in the wholesale and retail trade, followed by the manufacturing sector, construction, agriculture, mining, and quarrying. And in terms of size, majority of them are in the micro enterprises, about 76.5% of them, followed by small size, and the balance 2% is mainly at the medium size. And in terms of the economic contribution, SMEs contributed in 2019 to GDP around 38.9%. And in terms of growth, recorded a moderate pace of 5.8% in 2019 compared to 6.2% in the previous year. Due to the economic slowdown in line with the Malaysian GDP. And SMEs also an important contributor to the job creation, as it employs about 48.8% of total employees, mostly as semi-skilled employees. But however, in terms of export contribution of SMEs is still low at around 17.9% in 2019. So this COVID-19 pandemic and the subsequent MCO have significantly impacted and changed the SMEs landscape in the country. SME Corp Malaysia, we do conduct a series of surveys in March to May last year on about 1,920 SMEs to assess the situation and the implementation of the MCO. And the findings are quite similar to the findings from IDEAS and FMM, whereby 95% of them recorded immediate drop in sales, mainly to the temporary business closure, over-dependency on brick and mortar sales, channels, and lack of online presence. And this sudden drop in sales and cash squeeze has resulted almost 80% of them having cash in hand that can only last for 3 months. And about 50% mentioned that they can sustain their business for 1 month. So these findings, among others, contributed to the government taking immediate measures to ensure that the SMEs are able to stretch the cash in hand before they can access to other form of assistance. By May 2020, from the survey, the situation on the ground are still challenging, but some of the activity began to surface and gave breathing space to the SMEs after the introduction of the stimulus packages and the opening of the economy in early May 2020. And recognizing these challenges, the government has introduced various stimulus packages amounting to about 305 billion to facilitate economic restart in recovery, which comprise of the 20 billion economic stimulus package 2020, 150 billion Prihatin package, followed by 10 billion additional Prihatin packages for SME, 35 billion under Penjana, and also 10 billion Kita Prihatin package, which 98 billion or 30% of them are directly benefiting the SMEs. And these initiatives introduced will address or aim at critical pandemic related issues faced by the businesses, especially the SMEs, in the area of financing, cost of doing business, cash flow, job retention, and also adoption of technology and digitalization. And following the reimposition of MPO nationwide recently, an additional economic stimulus package under PERMAI worth 15 billion was announced by Yap Lip Seng Prime Minister in middle January this year, of which about 4 across all sectors. So among the key initiatives under this PERMAI package is the extension of the special grant, wage subsidy program 3.0, microcredit facilities by BSN, Agrobank, Tekun, and further reduction in electrical and rental. So in addition to this, about 8.7 billion has been allocated under the budget 2020 to benefit the SMEs, and the total commitment is highest in the record of budget allocation. And by COVID, the financial position of businesses for midterm and they have this maritime development and logistics scheme, tourism infrastructure scheme by BPMP, and they have I think green technology financing scheme to support the ESG agenda. And also substantial allocation was also announced in other critical area for digitalization and automation. For example, high-tech fund by Negara, which cater for the higher end, and also SME digitalization grant scheme, automation grant by MDEC that cater for the smaller size. And I think hence the key now is to ensure that we facilitate, monitor and measure the implementation of this initiative closely against the desired objective. And I think it's very important for the programs and initiatives to be implemented quickly and efficiently. And apart of that, I think the government needs to be agile, be prepared to review the initiatives as and when necessary. And this is because the outbreak has created uncertainties and economic conditions change rapidly, depending on how long and severe the health crisis will be. And moving forward, SME development cannot be done on piecemeal basis. We cannot just concentrate on innovation or automation or access to financing without also linking them right down to the market access. Holistic and integrated measures are required as SMEs have different needs and at different stages. I think reform measures need to facilitate SME throughout the entire value chain. For instance, enhancing consumption of local SME products and services by all, be it by the government or by private sector. I think it would be a more productive subsidization approach, inclusive innovation. One example is the concept of the micro connector program by SME Corp Malaysia, whereby in this program we provide simplified assistance for micro enterprises to set up or run their business, as well as to train the B40 community to gain new skill sets for income generation through entrepreneurship. It would be provide incentive for SME integration into the supply chain of GLC, MNCs, and the larger companies. And also, it is crucial to have a single focal point for all SME related matters. And under the Penjana, an online business advisory platform called My Assist, MSME, will be developed, which this platform aims to help and facilitate SMEs to get advisory services, especially during post-COVID-19. And also they can also get information on financial assistance, facilitation, technology supports, market access through various webinar sessions. And lastly, I heard that one of the recommendations is on information asymmetry. So I would just like to share that we have this website called SME Info Portal, managed by the Secretariat of the National Entrepreneur and SME Development Council. We update and upload from time to time the recent measures by the government for SMEs to read through and get this opportunity to know what's happening. And I think in summary, the key ingredient to success for the SME is for them to develop positive mindset and to differentiate strategies to survive this new normal by embracing digitalization for their business operations. And it is important to develop a business continuity plan and also pivoting business activities to remain relevant with the continuous support by the government. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alida. I think you are echoing some of the things that we obviously know are important, things like digitalization and pivoting business models and so on. But I think there's a difference between recognizing that these are the important things for the SMEs to take up, but also recognizing that there are a lot of barriers before the SMEs can actually get there. So people know this is what they need to do, but whether or not they have the right capacity, they have the right talent and the skill sets amongst the employees within Malaysia, I think there are a lot of barriers to that. And so how do we actually get to a place where this can happen efficiently? And obviously, I mean, we all know the pandemic accelerated a lot of these trends. And so the SMEs have needed to adapt much more quickly. But I think the infrastructure was not readily available for us to quickly make those changes in the time that's needed. But we actually don't have very much time for Q&A. I'm so sorry, but I think with your permission, we will extend this for another 10 minutes, but not beyond that. So we will end about 12:10, if that's okay with everyone, because we don't want to eat into your lunch as well, pardon the pun. And I'm going to now get some of the questions from the Q&A. So I think any of you who have questions, please put them up on the side. And in the meantime, I will go straight into asking these questions. So I think Laurence has indicated that he's going to answer quite a lot of them, but I will just kind of read out some of the themes. No, Laurence? Okay, so maybe we'll just go straight to the presentation. So this is specific to the research findings itself, right? And some of these questions are, okay, does our definition of retailers include roadside sellers in our idea of informal and unregistered businesses? And then I'm just looking for questions that are specific to the research itself. Okay, I think maybe Laurence, you can go straight into answering that. And then if you want, you can answer any of the questions, but just indicate like what is the theme of the question. And then I will know what to ask for the rest of the panelists.
Sure. Okay, I'll just come back on that point specifically. So yes, we would absolutely count the sort of roadside micro SMEs in that definition. And I think that's a really important point. I didn't make clearly enough, but was picked up by the other panelists, which is that the problem with the informality is also a question of regulatory enforcement. I think this was Yap Lip Seng who said it, which is that not only is it that one of the reasons why this question of formalization is really important. So we think it's important because we see that being able to access support mechanisms or the government to distribute aid in this crisis or support is contingent on you being formalized. But the problem is as well that on the other hand, when you formalize, suddenly that's when you become under the scrutiny of all the government enforcement. And it's actually links to what the High Commissioner mentioned, that meanwhile, if you operate outside of that boundary, then you're kind of in an unregulated space. So we have to also address the reasons why smaller businesses don't want to formalize. It's because it's actually just not in their interest day to day. And then when a crisis hits, suddenly that calculation changes. But we do have to make sure our enforcement on businesses operating without licenses is much more consistent. I think as Mr. Yap said, because otherwise we won't address this sort of the incentive for businesses to formalize. And I think the other factor of that I was emphasizing, and I'll repeat again, is around the regulatory barriers to that formalization when it becomes just too complicated for certain businesses to do it. The other point I would just mention, so I answered, I think somebody was asking about sort of specific measures right now. I think that we have got to a point now where I think the wage subsidy is really basically the primary, most kind of useful and flexible tool that we have. So I think what we need to do is, I do think there's a case to expand the wage subsidy. I think we've seen different ideas for how you can do that, but I think there is scope to expand it. And I think then that for me, the question is, okay, if we spend more now to preserve more SMEs through this period, that has to come hand in hand with some of these longer term policies to make sure we build that resilience in the future. What we don't want to do is spend that money and then not address these underlying challenges as well and face the same problem if there's another crisis. So my personal view is that we can expand, we can spend more to expand those kind of essential support mechanisms like the wage subsidy scheme, but that has to come hand in hand with meaningful long-term strategies on these structural issues like broadband access. I mean, that's a great example in the manufacturing case, like these regulatory barriers, like formalization, like equal enforcement, like updating the legal frameworks. So I think if we also commit to those reforms, I support like spending more now to keep businesses going. And I think the best mechanism we have to do that is through the wage subsidy. Thanks.
All right, thank you, Laurence. So I'm going to also throw this quite general question up to all the panelists. I will lump a few of them together. So one theme is basically what are the additional recommendations that the government should put in place to support SMEs throughout this period, to support their resilience, to support their innovation. And then another set of questions is more towards like what the experience has been in engaging with the government, I suppose in linking up these policy recommendations. So what's the experience been in linking up with government, providing recommendations to them, as well as what are the additional reports and long-term reforms that are needed in each of your sectors perhaps would be relevant. So I'm gonna start with Mr. Yap and also Engineer Ter.
Okay, I think since the beginning of the pandemic, we have been engaged by the government, various ministries and departments and agencies. We have been, we actually the one that source, their source of information in terms of hotel occupancy. We update them on a weekly basis just to see what are the trends, what are the actual activities on the ground. But having said that, that does not translate into actual support or decisions made by the government. We are there to advise, we are there to propose, we are there to suggest, but what the government decides to do after that sometimes is quite far apart from what we propose. And many times we actually see it as falling on deaf ears, to be harsh, if we want to say that. And we are quite disappointed in many ways, but also we are glad that there are a little bit of help coming here and there. Of course, we need more. We have been quite vocal over the entire period, and we hope the government will listen more to the industry rather than their own agencies delivering only the positive reports. I think the danger is there again that the government is getting positive reports to report positive news and not addressing the actual situation on the ground. That's all for me.
All right, and since you're talking as well, what more is needed? So both in terms of resilience as well as in terms of innovation, which I suppose leads to resilience.
Yeah, I think the industry is lacking on data management and analytics. That's the part of innovation for the tourism industry. We are really, really far behind compared to our neighboring countries in terms of managing of data and taking action based on data. Just look at tourism arrivals, for example. We recorded 26 million tourist arrivals in 2019, but half of them are Singaporeans. Do we even classify them tourists, and what do we do with that? And the report only comes out in the middle of the year for the year before, and it's not is not actionable. The data that comes up from the agencies and the Tourism Malaysia is not actionable anymore. It's already 6 months after the actual period. And that is what the government needs to support. A unified system, a live system that supports the industry, allows the industry to make decisions and to create more products and services that addresses the needs, the immediate needs and wants of the tourism industry. I think that's one innovation that the tourism industry really needs. And I think we spoke about this, another panelist actually spoke about this before, that technology sometimes is not accessible to the smaller players, and it gets really expensive for them as well. But we are moving into the era where technology is getting cheaper and more accessible. And that's where trade associations like us and FMM and MARC plays a major role in consolidating the needs and bringing this technology to everyone equally. We can consolidate all our members and all our stakeholders as a major stakeholder to the industry and demand and command access to the technology.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Yap. That's a really, really good point. I mean, I think data analytics and tech generally are a problem across sectors and not just with regards to industry, right? So like even for researchers like us. And I also like your point about how the data should be made available to all equally, which means that everyone has equal access, and it's not just the big players, and just because you have a good relationship with a certain government agency, you get access to that data. Mr. Ter, can you also weigh in on this, please?
Yeah, thank you, Tricia. Okay, I'd like to start off by saying that FMM strongly believe in the concept of Malaysia Incorporated, of the government and the industry working together as partners. After all, government is our partner. Whenever we make profit, government takes 24% away. So we believe in this strong partnership. Yeah. So to that question of government engagement, I'd like to urge the industries, the SMEs, to engage with the government through business associations like FMM, or whatever tourism association, engage as a collective voice. This will be more effective, rather than going on individually as a company. FMM, for example, we sit in many of government agency boards. This is an avenue for us to channel the feedbacks from the ground to the government, and also suggest to the policy makers, on recommendations from the ground. So this is a very good avenue for SMEs to channel your voice to the government. So come under business association. My point number one, come under business association. For example, we have, I lost count, so too many engagements, so many throughout the year. Under FMM, we have so many associations, so many committees looking after different interests. For example, the recent Act 446, it was, announced, and then in a very short time, it created quite a chaotic situation in the industry that where are we going to put our foreign workers? They have to comply to these guidelines. They have to stay, under what kind of accommodation condition and things like that. So FMM, we represented the industry, and we had a lot of sessions with the government asking for more time and things like that. Of course, I don't want to elaborate here on what are the feedbacks, what are these following actions. The Act 446, foreign workers freezing. Government says, you have to employ locals. There's no foreign workers, freeze foreign workers. So this has created, this kind of a sudden policy implementation without engagement with the stakeholder is a big issue. So we have continuously highlighted these kind of issues to the government through our representation in the board and through various dialogues organized. This recently, we highlighted to the government on the issues of implementation of delays in the implementation of grants. Because of COVID-19, when companies are doing certain projects on digitalization and automation, the experts cannot fly in from overseas. Yeah, so this has caused delay in the implementation of the project. But government so far has been silent on granting the extension of implementation period. So these are the issue faced. And also we have proposed various kind of linkage program to the government, how MNC is going to link up with the SMEs. So various kind of engagement. I think it's not just a one-off kind of engagement. It's a long-term, it's a journey. Engagement with the government is a journey. It's a long-term. Yeah, so in that sense, business association play a very important role to facilitate this engagement.
Sure. The partnership is definitely very important. Can I get views of maybe Alida and Dr. Mohan next regarding government support of SMEs? So there's a couple of different questions, and yeah, any of you who would like to answer is fine as well. So we recognize that government intervention and support is crucial for SMEs, but you know, and also I think Tan Sri Yong Pokon, who's here, is also saying that Mr. Yap mentioned that the wage subsidy of 600 is way below what other countries have extended. So it should be extended to avoid larger retrenchments in the coming weeks. So while we recognize that what we have done is nowhere comparable to what other countries have done in terms of supporting industry. I mean, I think Singapore has spent a lot more, right? And I think IDES as well has also talked about how we still have that fiscal capacity to be able to provide more support. But I think there's another question here as well about whether is it economically practical, and what's the realistic time frame for this support to be turned off or weaned off? So maybe Dr. Mohan, and then Alida, and anyone else, and then we will have only a very short time after. So I'm gonna, after this round of questions, get each of you to wrap up your thoughts for about a minute or so. But Dr. Mohan first. You're on mute, sorry, Dr. Mohan.
I was going to pick up on that question itself. Several participants made the statement. If you look at incentives and supporting mechanisms as subsidies, it would be very wrong. This is a short-term or medium-term measure. It's meant to keep the businesses afloat. And if the businesses that survive with these incentives, they would pay taxes, as Ter Leong Leng said, and that's the way. So how long should it be? As long as the pandemic is there. And I believe there is a way to predict when the pandemic will start slowing down, like it's happening in India now. When the numbers drop significantly, you know very well that that's when you can stop and the businesses can pick up on their own. The second point on innovation, I've also typed in the answer. What other supporting policies could be there? Procurement policies, carefully curated procurement policies, sector-wise, that would help local industry also.
Mm. Okay, that's really a good point. And we also do a lot of work in procurement, and we know that that's one way to actually support local companies who are importantly, the more efficient ones. Alida.
Okay, I would like to highlight two key points here. One would be to echo Mr. Ter. We need to continue with the engagement with the association and private sector. So in this way, we can identify what's going on, this situation on the ground. And secondly, would be the longer term SME strategy. SME development would be maybe I would say like focus on two-pronged approach. First would be the focus on the higher, focuses on balanced and sustainable growth, ramping up the creation of the high growth innovative firms. And the other one is to increase the micro enterprises in terms of their contribution to the economy. So on high growth firms, will be on targeted assistance in automation, digitalization, sustainability. And for the micro, increase their income through targeted support kind of program. That's all.
All right, thank you so much, Alida. In the interest of time, I would love to prolong this discussion and talk a lot more, you know, kind of also going into the recommendations that we had in the report. We didn't really get there as well. But maybe I can get each of you to provide your closing thoughts, your closing remarks. Very short, if you can, less than a minute. And we'll go according to the order that we went just now. So Laurence, if you can go first.
Okay, I think we've talked about many different issues, so I think I'll just end with this message. I think that my view is that the government, you know, has done many of the right things, but actually there is still room to do more. I actually don't think we should be afraid to spend more now at this point, both to do two things. Firstly, to strengthen the current support measures. So, like for example, the wage subsidy. And there are lessons learned about how we can implement those more effectively that we should try and incorporate, but we can do more of that. but that must come hand in hand, I think, with measures to promote adaptation for the longer term. And if, as Dr. Mohan said, we should see it as an investment, not a bailing out. But it must come, therefore, with that longer term view of how we increase resilience going forward. So I think if we're more ambitious, more aggressive in both those areas, the economy will be in a much stronger position by the end of this year. Thank you.
Thank you, Laurence. Dr. Mohan.
2 points, Tricia. Again, the interest in innovation and the investments and push in innovation systems, which also means there's a need for the government to develop linkages and through intermediaries like the business associations. Point number 1. SME Corp or the ministries should not be taking on this role. That's too much for them. The second point that came about in the interviews of many of the leaders of SMEs is an attitude apparently that they were all panicking and whether they should just shut down. And some of it's a bit esoteric and it's not a very researchy thing, but 3 or 4 CEOs mentioned the same thing, that they thought upon it themselves to survive and to continue employment. And if there could be that sort of a club to egg on each other, I don't know how to articulate it. It's a behavioral science thing, how to give this sort of a motivational thing for leaders. I'm actually thinking of now under the business school to start even some sort of an SME club. And this is particularly by the CEOs of some SMEs. I'll leave it to the business associations also to see how they could do that.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Mohan. So Mr. Engineer Ter Leong Leng, please.
Yeah, that's my surname. Thank you, Tricia. Okay, I'd like to end by saying that the industry is deeply alarmed by the warning by the health ministry that our health system is at breaking point. I think this is one very important fact that we have to acknowledge. The health system is at a breaking point, and also that there are 318 active clusters in the country right now, of which 30% are from the manufacturing sector, unfortunately. Yeah, so the manufacturing sector is very concerned about this. As I said, this ESG is very important, and we realize this point. We're very concerned, and we hope to work very closely with the government to how to flatten this curve. And the only solutions that we can look at, we can see is the balance between economic and health, between life and livelihood. We believe that total lockdown is not a solution, but we have to learn how to live with this pandemic, and how we can help SMEs to grow with digitalization and automation being this very important, gaining very important traction during this period. Yeah, so we hope the government can have more programs to help SMEs for these kind of long-term solutions. And as for the report, as far as the report is concerned, we'll definitely share it with our members. This very important report for post-COVID-19 recovery, building SME resilience by ideas. We share with our SME members as a very important future reference for us in the future in our engagement with our members and also with the government agencies. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you so much, Mr. Ter. Mr. Yap?
Okay, I just want to touch on something and just throw it in the open, something that's not been spoken of, but a sensitive matter, that's the political scene of Malaysia. I think politics plays a major role in all the responses and even the economy itself. And we have experienced multiple times that whenever when there's a change of government or change of minister or change of somebody up there, we have to start everything back to square one. All the engagements they have done, everything has been restarted and everything is back to square one. I think that's something that really affects the industries, really affects, of course, the SMEs as well and the entire economy.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Yap, for raising that very crucial point. I think many have recognized that political instability has a direct impact on the economy because of the uncertainty over policy direction. And of course, we have seen I think the management of the lockdown and the MCO, we didn't really talk too much about that, but I think especially in 2020, there were also a lot of, I won't say mismanagement, but lack of clarity over the way in which the lockdowns were rolled out and implemented. Okay, Alida, you get the last word.
Okay, one will be short. I think it's important to continue this collaborative effort between government and the industry. And like I said in the conclusion remark just now, it's important for us to develop positive mindset so that we can survive this new normal during this challenging time. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Alida. Once again, thank you so much on behalf of Ideas for your participation this morning. We will try as much as possible to get these insights and your views from this morning, as well as within the report, submitted to the government. Of course, we will submit it to SME Corporation and to you, Alida, and to the rest of your management, as well as to others and within ministries as well. And to conclude, I think just again from the report, number one, there have been implementation gaps in the crisis response, and we hope that government will be able to do better in 2021, because I think there will be more packages that are rolled out. Number two, if we want to move towards automation and digitalization, there's a lot more that needs to be done in terms of meeting the industry needs. So the kinds of training and I think the soft digital skills that were mentioned in the report, that's important. And finally, these regulatory reforms that can address more long-term, so not just about the short term, but that is needed to increase the way industries will adapt to all sorts of different situations. So once again, thank you for joining us this morning, and I will now release you so that you can have your lunch, but continue to follow ideas as we do a lot of work, not just in economics and business and trade issues, but on the more governance and political reforms related questions that Mr. Yap started to bring out at the end, and we do a lot of work in that area as well. So do follow us on our website and keep in touch. Have a great day ahead, all of you. Thank you.